All right, we are starting off 2024 with a bang on the channel. Today we are going to be talking about covenants and posing the question, will we see a Bitcoin soft fork in 2024? Let's jump in. All right, so building on the Bitcoin year in review video I just did last week, there has been an interesting amount of discussion across 2023 around different covenant proposals. And this, to me at least, seems the most likely category that we will see for the next upgrade and soft fork to Bitcoin. And a lot of people may cringe at that because we are obviously seeing a lot of the heated debate in the community around the topic of ordinals, of course. And doing tokens on Bitcoin has been around for a very, very long time, but it was really the SegWit and Taproot soft forks of 2017 and 2021 respectively that helped make things like ordinals much more reasonable and sort of easier to do. And so Taproot happened in 2021. The idea of another soft fork may give some pause, but I have been pretty surprised to see some of the momentum within the community around these ideas. So we're going to be unpacking this today. Let's start off with, what are covenants? Covenants essentially provide the ability to apply restrictions to how UTXOs can be spent. So recall the standard Bitcoin transaction model. You have inputs, funds coming into a transaction, and currently Bitcoin script defines conditions for these inputs coming into a transaction. You have to be able to do things like prove your ownership of said coins. But what we don't have is the ability to apply conditions to how those outputs from the transaction, the UTXOs, the unspent transaction outputs, are later spent themselves. And so that at a high level is what the idea of covenants is all about. Said another way, covenants allow transaction outputs to have conditions for the later transaction that spends it. So let's talk about the potential benefits and potential risks. From a benefit standpoint, there really are quite a lot of use cases that covenants could help with. And we'll talk about the different flavors of covenant proposals because that is also highly important. Some are more general, some are more restrictive and focused on maybe a particular use case, in the case of things like vaults. But covenants promise to support a lot of different useful applications. One, covenants could be used to improve the Lightning Network and other L2s. You could have things like batch channel openings, things like channel factories supported through covenants. That's a humongous deal, right? As I covered in my last video, there's been this realization in 2023 that Lightning, obviously we know that Lightning is tethered to the base chain via the requirement to do on-chain transactions to either open or close channels. But until fees started to get really elevated in 2023, I don't think that dependency sort of clicked for a lot of people. And so the idea of getting 8 billion people onto the Lightning Network is impossible without something else. And covenants would certainly take a step in the direction of being able to allow many different users to either share UTXOs or have some sort of batch channel opening for Lightning, etc. You could also support some sort of non-interactive channel, meaning today, you and I, in order to use Lightning non-custodially, we both have to be running some sort of Lightning node, right? Whether that's a standalone little machine at home, whether I've got it hosted in a data center somewhere, or whether I'm running a light client version on my phone, as you have in the case of things like Breeze, Phoenix, and some of the non-custodial mobile wallet options for Lightning that we now have. But the problem is that to do channel openings with a peer, both of those peers today have to be online, ready, waiting. And that's a pretty big assumption, especially given differences across different types of mobile phones in terms of apps that can run in the background, not run in the background. Like, it gets pretty messy. And so having more flexibility around that, I think, would be a very useful thing from a usability standpoint as well. And again, both of those would help facilitate more non-custodial Lightning usage, making that an easier process to get onboarded. The other huge category of benefits and use cases people are talking about is around security. So namely being able to implement something like a vault. And there's different definitions of vaults, but really at its basic level, a vault is this extra layer of protection to your long-term Bitcoin savings. So of course we have things like multi-sig where you can have multiple keys that are required to spend a particular output or particular set of funds. But what vaults would allow you to do is add and specify that, hey, my funds can only be spent to a certain set of addresses or certain address that I control. And so if an attacker comes and tries to, I don't know, $5 wrench attack you and get your device, or get, if you have a hot wallet, like whatever your situation is, there's all sorts of different attack modes that could be thwarted by having these additional conditions where, right, the attacker tries to spend, your Bitcoin and literally can't. Or a user might apply some sort of time condition, right? These coins can only be moved after a certain amount of time has passed. And we can see kind of a little diagram here on what that flow could look like. And so I think you have to sort of acknowledge that as like a pretty useful thing. That would be a really, really comforting extra layer of security for a lot of Bitcoin hodlers. You could do things like congestion control, again, highly relevant given the fee dynamics we've seen across this last year, right? Maybe you're a business of some kind or whatever the case is, and you can aggregate a number of different payments into one single UTXO, and then perhaps at a later time, once fees have come down, you could programmatically split that back into separate UTXOs. So there's some different kind of things around UTXO management that could be quite interesting. You could potentially improve the trustlessness of mining pools. I think that's, again, very on topic given all that we've seen around Stratum V2, around new mining pools like Ocean. I've done recent videos on all of those topics that I would encourage you to check out. There's definitely some use cases around privacy, this idea of coin pools. And then covenants could potentially enhance and or support a whole host of other type of more smart contracty type stuff, whether it's with discrete log contracts, different types of options, or other sort of contracts. So like the laundry list is pretty long. Again, we're going to talk about the different flavors of these covenant proposals in just a moment, but let's also talk about the potential risks. If this was such a no-brainer, why hasn't it been implemented? And indeed, as we will discuss, there is a rather rich history to this idea that goes way back. But one of the really big kind of knee-jerk reactions to this is like, whoa, wait a second. You're telling me there's restrictions in terms of how I could spend my Bitcoin? Like, what if a government or, regulator applies some sort of restriction that governs how I spend my Bitcoin? Or maybe an exchange could put some sort of restriction that details how I withdraw my Bitcoin, and I can only withdraw it to this sort of approved, address or whatever it is. And while I can sympathize with that type of thinking, and, adversarial thinking is always a good thing, I think that concern breaks down because it's the receiver actually, at least in the case of the CTV or check template verify proposal that I'm going to kind of spotlight a bit here. It's on the receiver to specify those conditions. So it's not the sender, right? The exchange, for example, could not apply restrictions to the address that you're providing for you to withdraw your Bitcoin. Now, keep in mind, the exchange could simply refuse to give you that withdrawal for any number of reasons, but they could do that with or without covenants, right? Like they don't, So I don't think that's a valid concern. But then again, we have these different types of covenants and covenant proposals. The idea of recursive and non-recursive. Non-recursive basically means, hey, for this transaction that's about to happen, here are now conditions that are going to be applied for the next transaction after that, but no more, right? Those restrictions don't get further propagated into the future, which is what recursive covenants would do, right? So who knows, you would have this ability to kind of craft a longer string of requirements for how this particular UTXO can be spent. I am sure that would open up, unintended things that people aren't even thinking about. So I do think that's kind of a valid concern, and which is why we'll keep that in mind as we take a look at some of the different proposals. Said another way, I don't think we would necessarily want to start with something like recursive covenants, certainly. There's also a question of fungibility, right? Like, do certain UTXOs that are encumbered by these additional spending requirements, are those different, or should they be valued differently than UTXOs that are not encumbered with those spending conditions? Again, I think this probably depends on the recursive versus non-recursive step, but it is something to think about. Honestly, for me, I think the biggest thing is probably, again, unforeseen implications of recursive covenants And then secondly, just potential UX complexity for the end user to ensure that there's an easy way for them to engage with covenants and to be aware of all the different implications, right? What you don't want is for, some newbie user to be trying to do something with covenants, not really aware of what's happening, and then all of a sudden, their Bitcoin ends up being constrained in a way that they weren't anticipating. That would be, at worst, really bad, and at best, frustrating at the very least. And so let's talk a little bit about the history of covenants. I think this goes well back to folks like Greg Maxwell talking about this around, I think, 2013, maybe even earlier. And additionally, what I don't think a lot of people realize is that there actually is live covenant functionality on the Liquid sidechain. I've done a whole video on Liquid if you are not familiar. It's a federated sidechain to Bitcoin. Part of the benefit of Liquid is that you can kind of do some experimentation before proposing these types of changes to the base chain. And so Liquid introduced a couple new opcodes, followed by 30 what are called introspection opcodes as part of Liquid's Taproot upgrade. And so if we ask, well, how has that gone? You have things like Fuji Money, which is a company enabling users to borrow an algorithmic stablecoin backed by Bitcoin. Blockstream Research has put out research on how you could do decentralized option contracts with this stuff. Barack, who is the developer behind the ARC proposal, has emulated Vault, which is one of the specific covenant proposals we'll talk about, using Liquid covenant opcodes. So there are real things that I think are a very helpful gauge. A very common piece of pushback with these types of upgrades is let's do it in a lower risk, lower stakes environment to prove it out and then, bring it to Bitcoin. Well, the fact is that we have some of that on Liquid. Blockstream's also working on Simplicity, which is a new programming language that could implement covenant-like functionality at an even lower level. So that could be yet another interesting way that we might see covenant functionality brought to Bitcoin over time. But let's now take stock at some of the different proposals. We can categorize these proposals in a few different ways. The first is, are they a more generalized or complete covenant proposal? A good example would be OptX, and this would basically just allow you to bring more transaction information onto what is called the Bitcoin stack. Bitcoin script is a stack-based programming language, which refers to the data structure that is sort of kept as operations are being executed, as the code is being executed, as you do different things on Bitcoin. And so by being able to bring more of this transaction data onto the stack as it's getting executed, you can start to apply those different types of restrictions. So you could even say something like, hey, the UTXO has to be of a certain size. It has to be at least 10 million sats in order to be moved. So you could get quite specific with the types of rules that you could implement. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have much more kind of specialized use case specific type proposals, such as OpVault. OpVault would seek to bring specifically that vault functionality that we were talking about earlier and nothing more. Another way to categorize these are whether they are opcode-based proposals. And so an opcode or a operation code is a primitive within Bitcoin script. Think of it like creating a new function in Excel, right? How you can say equal sum, blah, blah, blah. You can also create, different functions. So an opcode is kind of like a function in that way. Critically, the introduction of new opcodes is by definition a consensus level change. So it's a change to the consensus rules because we are now introducing fundamentally new or different opcodes than what we have previously been using, hence necessitating a soft fork, which is a backwards compatible change and upgrade to Bitcoin. So you have the opcode-based approaches versus the SIG hash-based approaches like APO. And this category is largely being viewed as a necessary prerequisite for something like L2, which, as the name suggests, would be a improvement to some of the kind of L2s like Lightning. It would basically improve the way that we keep channel state, which is fundamentally what Lightning is, right? It's the ability to keep this off-chain channel state and to do that accurately and efficiently. L2 is a proposal that would help with that, and a covenant proposal like APO is seen in many ways as a prerequisite to that. And so the proposals that have garnered the most discussion, I think, community support, etc., are a fewfold. I do think Vault is very appealing, given its specificity. I think it's pretty unambiguously helpful. And so I certainly think there's a chance that we see OpVault. But, a lot of people say, well, it's not enough, right? Like, there's other things that if we implement, we anyways get Vault functionality, but we also get all this other stuff. And so one that I think for a lot of people has gravitated towards this kind of sweet spot is CTV, or Check Template Verify. This is codified in BIP 119, and I did a video on this well over a year ago. This is an idea that has been around for some time. CTV was designed back in 2019 after, again, many years of discussion around covenants. The main developer behind this was a guy, Jeremy Rubin, who I think was just trashed by the community. It was pretty unfortunate actually to see. I think at the time, and this was like 2020, 2021, the community perceived a lot of urgency with which Jeremy and proponents of CTV were sort of championing this soft fork and trying to kind of ram it through either as part of the Taproot upgrade or kind of in parallel to that. So I think the community at the time was just not receptive, not ready to engage with the technical merits of the proposal and the potential benefits that it could bring to users. And it was just this sort of immediate allergic reaction of like, no, we don't want more change. And oh, by the way, these different restrictions that could be applied. Like, I think there was a lot of surface level thinking at the time, and it just wasn't the right time. But I think importantly, CTV strikes a pretty compelling balance. On the one hand, you have like enough of these pretty valuable use cases, like the Lightning related ones we talked about earlier, like Vaults, potential privacy related stuff. Like, it checks a lot of those potential use case and benefits boxes we were talking about earlier, but it also, I think, does a good job of trying to mitigate the risks. Importantly, it is a non-recursive covenant proposal, and I will leave a couple resources for you in the description if you want to take a look either at the actual specification, which is on GitHub. So again, this is fully spec'd out. There's also been, I think, a 5 Bitcoin bounty on this proposal for a number of years now that has gone unclaimed. So at this point, I think it's a pretty thoroughly reviewed proposal from a technical standpoint. I'm not aware of any like technical concerns, and it's more about the design choices of, well, does it do enough? Does it do too much? And there's of course going to be arguments on either side of that. But impressively, we have seen this chorus of support growing. If you spend any amount of time on Twitter, you have now probably started to see certain users putting, opt CTV or when covenants or whatever the case is in their handle, signifying their support. There have been people creating threads asking, is this consensus? And they're kind of noting all these people that have voiced their support for CTV. And so comparing that to 2021, where the community was like absolutely allergic to this type of proposal, it is a completely different story now at the beginning of 2024. So what might we see next? So again, my guess is as good as or bad as any, but I suspect we will continue to see debate at least through the first half of this year. I do hope there's more awareness around the fact that some of this is on Liquid. And interestingly, we will apparently see the launch of Simplicity on Liquid slated for around Q2. And the reason that could be important is it would potentially give developers some tools to really kind of play with some real world covenant type use cases to further bolster the examples that we already have. Rusty Russell here makes a good point that covenants really are most sensible in the context of Taproot, which would allow for limitations to be implemented that could always be tightened up or relaxed later on without further substantial changes in the future. And then I think this is a pretty good argument from Owen here, who basically says, look, like everything we're talking about use case wise for CTV, you could technically hack together today with PSBTs or partially signed Bitcoin transactions and trust. So net, where do I fall? I think in the last video when I did this well over a year ago, I was pretty hesitant, mostly because I just didn't think there was the community level reception to do anything with this. But I've been pretty blown away now at the chorus of advocacy and support for this. And I think you're going to see that trickle down to more average Bitcoin users over the course of 2024. Net, I do think covenants would be beneficial for Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. And I think CTV, of all the proposals, strikes a pretty nice balance between minimizing some of the potential unforeseen consequences of things like recursive covenants, while also bringing a number of pretty unambiguously helpful upgrades for anyone who cares about Lightning, anyone who cares about self-custody and security of your long-term Bitcoin holdings. Again, these things are never riskless, but when you weigh up the pros and cons, I do think something like CTV would be a net positive. However, at the same time, I'm not personally in any rush to see this activated. And so back to the prediction of will we see this in 2024? I'm not so sure. I think there will still be a contingent of hesitancy, but I do think we're going to see covenants in some sort of soft fork sometime either 2024, 2025. That would be my bet at this point, just trying to read the community, where sentiment is at, etc. So interesting stuff. But I'm curious to hear, what do you think? What are your predictions? Are we going to see something like CTV this year? Are we still a ways out? Are there other proposals that you think are better or that we should start with? Are you against covenants entirely? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like, use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. And again, as a citizen of Bitcoin, it is your responsibility to at least be aware of some of these topics. And particularly if you're trying to be that first-class self-sovereign citizen of Bitcoin, running your own Bitcoin node, it is ultimately you that determines what consensus rules of Bitcoin you run. And so if that's you, this is all the more important for you to at least be aware of. And if you were so enamored with this content and you want to donate to a pleb, which really does help me continue to make these videos, you can do so in a number of ways. There's the super thanks feature built directly into YouTube. If you happen to be using something like the Get Alby browser extension on Lightning, you can just click that and it'll automatically detect that you're watching my channel, which is pretty cool. Or alternatively, you could send some sats over Lightning to my Lightning address, which is me at www.ianmajor.xyz. Or if you have any issues with that, you can use ragermajor@getalby.com. I'm also flashing up this QR code, as you can see, if you'd prefer to just scan that guy. And for those of you who are asking how you can get in touch with me, I am on Vita. Maybe you want some additional hand-holding or one-on-one mentorship. You're starting a Bitcoin business, you want to create a multi-sig for your family, you want to learn how to run a node, you want to accept Bitcoin payments for your business, whatever the issue, whatever the question, reach out to me on Vita. You can even schedule time and video calls with me on Vita where we can walk through some of that stuff together. We'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you then.